All right.
All right.
And let me know when we're live.
Here we are.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. It's good to be back with you again and see what we have in store for us, where we wander in and out. And as we get started, let's pray. Thanks, Father, for this time together, just to interact with some topics and some questions, some issues and some matters that have some level of significance, not only in the way in which we interact with you, but interact with the world around us. And so we'd ask for good communication, for clarity, for stuff that we can incorporate readily into our lives so we can be more effective in our demonstrating to those around us who you are and how they can connect with you. Thanks for all who join us right now, as well as those who will join us later. In Yeshua's name. Oh, good. We're having network connection issues. We just got notified. So if there's a lag, or if
There's quite a lag.
or if the audio is not quite as good as you might want it to be, we apologize for that. And I can tell as I'm talking and watching myself on the monitor that we definitely have a lag that way. So try to live with that. I'm sorry about that. We will try to work as effectively as possible despite that. Patrice and I just got back from a Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations conference in San Diego, and that's a long plane ride. And as I was
Two long plane rides.
Two long plane rides, yes. And as we were on the plane, I was doing a number of things, including marking assignments and exams for students. But then I was doing some reading in a journal. Turns out to be a journal of the Evangelical Theological Society. And I looked at an article or two, but then I was going through the book review section. And as I was going through the book review section, I came across something that caught my interest. This particular book review was on a book that does not have a whole lot of, how shall we say it, pizzazz or draw to its title. The book is called All the Genealogies of the Bible, Visual Charts and Exegetical Commentary by Nancy Dawson. Well, as you're probably well aware, if you're not certainly party to this particular practice, people tend to skip the genealogies when they encounter them in the scriptures. They may take a look at the first verse and the last verse, if even they look at that, and then they move on to the rest of the story, as if there was nothing significant about the genealogies. I'm reminded of a rabbinic saying. I don't remember from which part of the rabbinic literature it's from, but there's an understanding that there's not a word of the Torah that is wasted. So that is intended to include genealogies. I started reading, and then I came across, near the end of the book review, something that really attracted my interest. And the book reviewer was listing a couple examples from both the Older Testament and the Newer Testament that were interesting parts of this particular book. And here's what the couple paragraphs from the end it says. Final Older Testament example brings together details from Kings and Chronicles. A lot of people tend to skip those texts too, to make a well-known story more personal. When Athaliah seized power on the death of her son, Ahaziah, quick aside here, Athaliah was the queen who seized power. So, by the way, this far back in Israelite history, we had not just kings but queens. Now, this particular one happened to be an evil queen.
Atalia. Her name's Atalia.
Atalia. Okay, not a...
Athaliah? No.
I thought it said Atalia, but okay, Atalia, yes.
Yeah, much prettier.
All right. Anyhow, she attempted to murder all the heirs to Judah's throne so that she could secure her own. And the priests had hidden away one of the direct descendants of the Davidic line, a kid by the name of Joash, and so the line of David was protected and preserved despite this particular issue. Well, here's what the review says. It will be remembered that Joash and his nurse were hidden away in the temple, but it is often overlooked that it was Joash's aunt, Jehoshaphat, who rescued them. Moreover, Jehoiada, the priest, who protects and later coronates Joash, was in fact Jehoshaphat's husband. In other words, two of the key characters preserving the line of David ended up being the aunt and uncle of this remnant of the line of David. And then it continued to give an example from the Newer Testament. Here's what it then says about the genealogy of Mary, Yeshua's mother. And I think in the past we've talked about genealogies here and there as part of our Stump the Stars, and I'll review that in a minute. An example from the Newer Testament that may be known to many, but became far more meaningful through this book, is Jesus' family. It is more significant than many may recall that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was first cousin to the far older Elizabeth, making John the Baptist the second cousin of Jesus. You may have been familiar with that. Mary's sister was the mother of the disciples James and John, making them first cousins of Jesus. Okay, so when you read about the disciples, there were disciples who were part of his family, his cousins. This adds a personal flavor to Matthew's story of their mother asking Jesus if they could sit by his side when he ascended to the throne, because they were part then of the royal family,
They're
so to
cousins,
speak.
yeah.
They're cousins.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's not the thing that struck me most, but I share that with you. Dawson leans on extra biblical genealogical information thoroughly cited to suggest that Mary's mother, Yeshua's mother, that Mary, the mother of Yeshua, her mother, was a Levite who married a man from the tribe of Judah, who was the brother of Joseph of Arimathea, making him the great uncle of Yeshua. You remember Joseph? So Uncle Joseph gave nephew Yeshua his unused grave to bury Yeshua. It adds an interesting touch to the story.
He wasn't just, Joseph of Arimathea was not just a stranger who came up and said, would you like my...
Yeah, he was not just a stranger, but apparently, as the text indicates, he was also a person of significance within higher-end Jewish circles. But, did you catch this? Mary's mother was a Levite. That means Yeshua comes from not only the royal line, which is what's spelled out very clearly in Mary's genealogy in Luke 3, but he also comes from the Levitic line. Even more fitting then, as Hebrews causes us to understand. No, let me back off of Hebrews, because that'll not clarify but confuse things.
Yeah.
That Yeshua is not only of the royal line, but it's also of the priestly line. So he functions as both king and priest. Now, by the way, the argument for Yeshua's priesthood is that he is after the order of Melchizedek, according to Hebrews, which we've known and talked about before. But what I find very interesting here now, which I only discovered as in this past week, was that Yeshua was a Levite, or of Levitic ancestry as well, not just of Davidic ancestry.
And that does change things quite a bit, because once again, just like with Joseph Arimathea, was not a well-intentioned stranger who came up and said, here, have my family tomb. But that Yeshua, which I think has been a sticking point, at least in books and studies of Newer Testament, that we just don't understand how he's from Judah. He doesn't have any right to call himself a priest, except if he did. He
So-
just did not follow that career path that was open to him.
All right, now, here's the thing. This was new news to me and maybe new news to you, but it was not news to the people who were around Yeshua. Joseph certainly knew he was Yeshua's uncle. James and John, the disciples, certainly knew they were his cousins. And Mary and the family, cousins and second cousins alike, would have known that Yeshua had Levitic ancestry as well. Fair enough? Now, by the way, as far as genealogies are concerned, there were two groups of people for whom it was absolutely essential to know their genealogy. One is, of course, the people of the royal line, and the other, as Ezra indicates, after the return from captivity, the genealogy of priests was very important. They had to be able to demonstrate they were of the Levitic line before they could function. And speaking of genealogies, just a little further, and this is by way of review, the genealogy in Luke is Mary's genealogy. The genealogy in Matthew is Joseph's genealogy. That's why you have not one but two genealogies, and the one does not contradict the other. When people assume that both genealogies are Yeshua's genealogy through Joseph, then they have difficulty trying to reconcile that with the genealogy that's in Luke, which is, as it turns out, of Mary. And how do we know that this was the case? Well, there's a couple significant textual indicators, one in each of the genealogies, that lets you know what's going on if you read carefully. So I'm just going to review that, and then we'll move on beyond genealogies.
No, I have something to say.
Oh, okay.
Not right now.
Okay. Matthew traces Yeshua's genealogy back to David and to Abraham, indicating two of the themes that's going on here, and then comes up with the concluding statement in verse 17 in chapter. This must be significant for Matthew because it's at the very beginning, first chapter. Right off the bat, this is what you jump into. So you know that you're jumping into a Jewish story. We talked about that somewhat in the Gospels course last semester. There were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. Why is this grouped into 14s? Because, interestingly enough, if you take the letters of David's name, Dalet, Vav, Dalet, each Hebrew letter has a numerical value. It also serves as a number. The total value of David's name is in fact 14. So in effect, the genealogy is saying, if you're reading it carefully, Yeshua, yes, it starts out by saying he's the son of David. Then 14 generations say, don't forget, of David. 14 generations, don't forget, of David. 14 generations, don't forget, of David. And then it says, all right, this is what lets us know that he is in fact the greater son of David. Here is his genealogy. We know that it's a genealogy of Joseph because in verse 16 it says, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Yeshua, who's called the Messiah. So we know this is not Mary's, this is Joseph's genealogy. And it lets you know that right away. By the way, also very interesting that this Joseph, like the other Joseph, was in fact the son of Jacob. So some interesting things behind that genealogy. Then we get to Luke chapter 3. And this is it's just before the very beginning of Yeshua's ministry rather than the beginning of his life. But again, it's a genealogy to verify that he was the son of David. verse 23. Now Yeshua himself was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. Guess what? That's when priests began their ministry, just for the fun of it. He was the son, ready? So it was thought of Joseph. All right? But in effect, the text implies that he was thought to be the son of Joseph, what was in fact the son of Heli. As it turns out, Heli is Mary's father. There's a reference in the Talmud that describes, or that says, that Heli was the father of Mary.
And we would call him Eli.
Yes. I'm sorry. Yeah.
The H is not the letter H, it's rough breathing.
Rough
So
breathing.
we would call him Eli.
Okay. So we will transform what's in the text, even though it's said Heli there. But yes, it's Eli. Okay. There's another indicator that this is the case, because it says, he was the son, as was thought, of Joseph. That's what the text literally reads. But in the Greek, the next says, he was the son of not Eli, but the Eli, the son of the Matat, the son of the Levi. And there is a definite article in front of each of the names going all the way back to the very beginning of time. The fact that there is no article on Joseph, but there is an article on Eli, is an indicator that the author is telling us this is how the line goes through. It doesn't go through Joseph, it goes through Eli. And the grammar itself gives you that as an indicator. So he was the son. If you want to read it, put it in parenthesis. So it was thought of Joseph. He was the son of Eli. In other words, Mary's father. Fair enough? So some interesting things about the genealogy. And although this is the genealogy, the line of the genealogy in Luke 3 that goes back to David, there is another line, apparently, as the book indicates that I shared with you from. There is a line of Mary that goes back through the Levites. And ultimately, just as I'm closing this, it just popped into my mind. Yeshua was the son of, or in this case, the grandson of Eli. Who was the son of Matat, who was the son of Levi. Now, this is not the Levi that goes back to the sons of Jacob, but it's interesting that very early in her line there is a reference to the fact, or how should I put it? No. There is something that alludes to the fact that Mary has another line that goes back through the original Levi. Fair enough? Now, another thing to know about genealogies is the genealogies of Matthew and of Luke are not complete. They are selective. And Matthew selected the 14s so as to make a point. He didn't include everybody in the genealogy. You can check that out by looking at genealogies in Kings and Chronicles. And in selecting the particular names Luke selected, you'll note that he did specifically include a Levi, because he understood, Luke knew that that Mary had a Levitic connection in her line. How do we know? Because Luke said in the opening paragraph of his gospel, I've investigated all things from the beginning to see not just checking with the eyewitnesses, but stuff that was written as well as stuff that was shared orally. So I can give you a straightforward and trustworthy account, O Theophilus. And there are indicators, and I mentioned this in the Gospels course, indicators in significant sections that are unique to Luke, that these particular parts of the story come directly from Yeshua's family. So Luke did know Yeshua's family. So we can assume that Luke would also have been aware that Mary was not only descended through David, but that at least one part of her line also goes back to Levi or Levi. Okay, I've babbled on long enough. You were going to add something about genealogies.
Yeah, well, I want to say something about Luke, and then I want to mention the thing about genealogies. So this is a really good time to mention that Luke, every time I want to remember where a passage is that discusses Yeshua's conversation with a woman, it's always in Luke. Every time there's something about a woman, it's in Luke. It might be in one of the other Gospels, but it's always in Luke. And I have no research background to claim this, but I'm going to claim it anyway. Luke is the only one that tells us at the very beginning, it's part of the birth story, what Mary prays, what Miriam prays when she finds out she's going to have a baby. And we have the whole prayer there. How does Luke know that and the other guys don't seem to know it? Luke knows a lot, and this is another example, about the mother's link to the Levitical priesthood. How does he know that? Well, call me crazy, but I think he did his preliminary research because he is a historian. He takes it upon himself to write the history, remember, to Theophilus. That's explained in Acts.
And Luke.
And both in Luke. So he's writing a history of this person named Yeshua to Theophilus, the high priest at the time, after Yeshua's death and resurrection, in order to explain who and why this person is and who cares anyway. And it's obvious he did a lot of interviewing of Miriam. He must have spent hours with her getting the inside scoop of all these things. Maybe he asked her, maybe she just offered what she knew. But I think that's so valuable to know and to consciously realize that just as David, the whole story of David, and if you see the whole story and you don't just have a 30-second summary, David had very interesting relationships with women, and I don't mean in a tawdry way. He had those too. But he admired women. He talked to women. He watched them with an eye to seeing what their character was, what their qualities were. And that is something that is important about David. But then Luke somewhat replicates that. He records these stories that otherwise we would have no recollection of. And the Eli and that genealogy just makes it, to me, more clear that he spent a lot of time with Miriam and got down her recollections and what happened with her. Because remember, she outlives Yeshua. Well, not in the eternal sense, but you know what I'm saying. And the second thing I was going to say is about genealogies in general. In one of my missions classes, we would be talking about, because we weren't just talking about America or the Western Hemisphere, we were talking about the world, how the message of Yeshua goes throughout the whole world. And if we, as 21st century Americans, think that the Bible was written just for us, because we're the important ones in the whole realm of history, my professor said, think again, because here's what he knows. He spent 25 years in China. He was there when China became communist, and he was one of the last missionaries to leave communist China. And he worked with an organization that also included many missionaries to Africa, and they would get together certain times and they would share their experiences and share insights that they had. And he said there were several tribes in Africa, when they read the scripture, or it was read to them because it probably wasn't in their language, they said, oh, this Jesus guy, he must be important because his genealogy is so long. And no one who is not important would have a genealogy so long. So therefore, he must be listened to. So even though things don't seem valuable to us in the 21st century in America, they are valuable to other cultures. And so once again, I wish they would have skipped that part. Let me just roll these pages over and get to the good stuff. That would not be seen as correct in other nations of the world. And I think that is a really healthy attitude for us to understand. It was written for us, but not just us. It was written for a worldwide audience, eventually. That's all.
Cool. Yeah, and very important insight. And obviously, genealogies were important in this day and age. I'm talking about Bible times, Second Temple period, as well as certainly. Well, let me back that up. It's emphasized towards the end of the Second Temple period by the genealogies we have here in the biblical text, but it's emphasized at the beginning of the Second Temple period in the book of Ezra that genealogies are important. 2 kings, 2 priests, to show, as you said, to show the importance of a particular person or so. So don't skip over them. Take a look at them, and if you want to learn more about them, go get the book.
Yeah, didn't you say that this woman actually has been through and investigated each of the people in each of the genealogies?
Yes, something like
Which
that.
we had never heard of anybody actually doing that.
Yeah.
Once again, scholars skip that part, get to the story. But she actually took the time to go through it, which I would think would be very, very interesting. Are we getting the book? We are, aren't we?
We can.
So you made me read all that on the plane, and you spent all
Yeah.
that time on the plane,
Yeah,
and
because
you're
it was
not going to get the book?
Well,
There must be other stuffs in the book.
yeah, it's 600 pages long.
600 pages on the genealogies.
And
you think you're busy and important.
The asking price is $50.
Well, that's not too bad, actually.
And again, it's all the genealogies of the Bible by Nancy Dawson.
We don't know Nancy, but maybe we wish we did.
So anyhow, there's some interesting stuff that came out of that that hopefully adds a little dimension to a couple of the Bible stories and certainly to the genealogy of Yeshua. Yeah. Oh, the other thing I was going to mention about Matthew's genealogy is, and I was reminded of this because of what you just said, is that Matthew chooses to include 3 women or 4 women? 4 women in that genealogy.
In Matthew's genealogy.
In Matthew's genealogy, yes. Significant women in the line of Yeshua, the Davidic line. There's Rahab, there's Ruth, who you won't be surprised, and there's also a gal by the name of Tamar, who gets short shrift somewhere in the early 30s of the chapters of Genesis. Don't remember exactly which chapter it is.
And David also has a daughter named Tamar.
And David has yeah. And then, of course, the 4th woman is Mary herself. So women were significant, even though some people have forgotten that, and some people still haven't gotten around to knowing that, even in our day and age. All right, any questions on the genealogies that we've talked about, or in general about genealogies?
I have a question. I had heard from a podcast of David Levin up in Jacksonville that the last name of Levin or Levin is from the early priests, the Levites, and that's what came out of that. Do you agree with that? Everybody with the last name comes from that particular priesthood?
I would not want to say it quite so absolutely.
Okay.
Because of intermarriage.
Because of intermarriage. But certainly, okay. In Jewish history, you were known as you saw here in the genealogy, so-and-so, son of so-and-so. When it came time to take on what we would call surnames or last names, you were often given the name of the occupation you were in, or you were given the name of your family member. So that's where we get Levin, Levitt, Levi or Levi, like the...
Levis.
Yeah.
There can be modifications on, especially the ending of the name.
Yeah. And that includes Levi's such as what I'm wearing.
Yeah.
So
He is wearing Levi's because Levi, his first name was Levi. Levi Strauss went out to California during gold rush days and decided that the gold miners needed much heavier wearing pants. They were using probably their only pair of pants, which was a bad idea because they needed to be able to sustain digging in dirt and being on your knees all day. So he decided to create his own using a special kind of cloth that came from France.
So, to answer the question, yes, there is a likelihood of a family, if not a tribal connection, carried on through the last name because of part of family history. We did have, by the way, genealogies that were effective genealogies, historical genealogies. I am told by Jewish people in general, going into, well, certainly there was prior to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Those were all destroyed when the temple was destroyed. But there was an ongoing personal family history that carried on some of these tribal connections, some of which were put down in writing, and we lost whatever was left of that in the Second World War. At least that's what I was told concerning our traditions concerning genealogies. Now, so last names. There's another frequent indicator along with Levi or Levi or Levitt or Levine, and that is Cohen.
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 So related to Cohen are all these last names that you're familiar with.
Yes, because the Hebrew term for priest is in fact Cohen. Levi, the Levites were not necessarily priests. Not all Levites were priests, but all priests were Levites. Let's put it that way.
Correct.
Then there's the line of the Cohens and all kinds of variations on spelling on that.
Or Kahan. I mean, it can be. I don't think George M. Cohan, who wrote the patriotic songs, I think he was Irish. I don't think his name is related to Cohen. But there's so many kinds of, not just variations on Levite or Levitical, but also Cohen, Kahan, Kohn, K-O-H-N, Kohn, C-O-H-N. They're just dozens and dozens of these names.
Yeah, and in fact, we've got a friend who now lives in Israel by the name of Jamie Cowen, C-O-W-E-N. That's just another variation of the same. In my own family, my great-grandfather's name was Morris Kohn, K-O-H-N, in Hungary. That became transformed in the days of Hungarian and Austrian nationalism to Komlos. So those are just some variations. I had a professor when I was doing my degree in Judaic Studies at Spertus College of Judaica, whose last name happened to be Israeli, was Bargad, B-A-R-G-A-D. Bar is the Aramaic for son of, and G-A-D is one of the 12.
Gad.
One of the 12 sons of.
But I wouldn't call him Bar Gad.
No.
Very ugly sounding.
Yeah, it's one of the sons of Jacob. So his family line obviously had some sort of connection, or they felt that they had some sort of connection back to that tribe.
George Siegel, the actor, he died recently. His last name also is indicative of high priesthood. So his family, the Siegels, not seagull like birds, but Siegel, has to do with the high priesthood. Still lines of those also exist through today.
So, fun with Jewish last names. We played the role here just very briefly of Henry Louis Gates. If you are familiar with that, it's one of our favorites.
Yes.
So, all right, any other questions on genealogies or related?
Thank you.
No, Betty, thank you.
You're welcome.
That's an interesting aside on our discussion. All right. Then another thing that happened on our trip to San Diego was at the Winter Leadership Conference of the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. Patrice was asked to teach a session.
Yeah, I won't be asked again.
I don't know about that, but maybe you will be because you didn't get a chance to finish it.
Yeah, they only gave 35 minutes to each of us who were speaking in the afternoon, and we weren't divided into groups. Everybody heard the person who was up front. But the first thing I said was, there's not enough time. 35 minutes is not enough time. It is enough time to give a sermon, because a sermon, you have the context. Everybody's read the verse or the verses surrounding it. So all that explanatory thing is all taken care of, and then you can just go into an explanation or a discussion of a short part of the whole reading, but not when you have to introduce your topic from the very beginning and put it in context and give definitions. There's just simply not enough time.
So, that, in thinking about that, prompted us then to go into this particular topic, which will last certainly more than this particular stump. We've talked about this kind of topic before in previous stumps, but it's always good to review. And I'm not sure how complete we were in previous times.
Yeah, because we didn't used to, this wasn't a topic.
No.
This was, we'd pick out one of these, or somebody would
Yeah.
bring up one of these, and we discuss it.
All right, in that case, with that introduction, I turn it over to you.
Oh, could you?
Of course, because
All right, so I have here a list of, on this page I have 6, on the second page I have 4, that come from my PowerPoint that I had for my talk.
you want to set a bit of the context for this part of
This part
of your talk.
Oh, this part of my talk. Okay, I'm going to just narrow it down to this. John and I have been a little distressed in the past 5 to 10 years in that we overhear people talking. They're either sitting next to us, or as we walk by, we hear the topic of conversation that they're speaking with their friend, or they'll make a quick remark in the middle of someone else's talk. And we have really been distressed by what we have heard, because there have been more than 1 or 2 anti-Semitic remarks. And when I say anti-Semitic remarks, I'm not talking about all Jews are rich and all Jews are smart, and not those, but the interpretation of verses in the scripture. And the emphasis is the wrong word. Twist is not the word. Spin. They've been spun, the way they've been spun. What I had to remind everybody at the conference was Messianic Judaism came out of the evangelical church. That's where everybody started. There could have been independent people, but most everybody came out of a church. Consciously, we made a decision in the mid-70s. There was not one organizing organization, but because we had talks amongst ourselves in Chicago, for instance, which is where we were, there was, you'd have one Jewish believer in this church, and then the church down the street would have 2 Jewish believers, and then the church over there would have 1 Jewish believer. And in each church, when we got together as Jewish believers, which we did once a month, because there was like a club. The club was the Hebrew Christian Alliance of America. So that was Jewish believers would come from all these churches, And they'd meet like on a Saturday night, correct? They'd meet together, and they'd hear a speaker, and they'd have brownies. And that's what being a Hebrew Christian was like. And then everybody go back to their churches. And since we had a bunch of Jewish believers that lived right around our apartment in Chicago, we would stay after the meeting and we'd be talking. And we'd say things like, I don't understand. Well, first of all, we didn't like being the only Jew in the congregation. That was uncomfortable because, and I'm sure African Americans who go to churches who are primarily white, and then somebody from the front goes, and here is our African American friend. Isn't he wonderful? We love him. Stand up and wave to everybody. And it is so awkward and embarrassing and terrible. And that happened to Jewish people, one in the congregation. Oh, this is our Jewish friend, and he's enjoying our congregation. And I don't understand why more Jewish people don't come to our congregation, et cetera, et cetera. It's embarrassing. It was just humiliating in certain cases. So we get together and we complain about that. Or we share stories about that. And then we go, why don't churches do the Shema? What's wrong with the Shema? Why don't they say that? And so it was these kinds of discussions. And little did we know that there were other groups in other parts of the country at the same time where we're getting together and going, yeah, this is weird. I would really enjoy doing this and this and this. I don't understand why churches are so dead set against doing this and this and this. And it was usually taken out of Jewish worship that we knew about, or it was meaningful to people. But it was because we were all in separate churches. So we made a decision. I think the knowledge that if churches are meeting on Sunday, there could be another day of the week where we could get together and not have a speaker and brownies, but we could do some Jewish liturgy together, or do the Shema, or learn Jewish song. Do something else that would bring us together. And that's really the down and dirty roots of what happened, starting in the early 1970s, and also quickly. So at that time, as the Vietnam War was coming to an end, you had a lot of people coming to America from those, the Southeastern Asia, the war-torn part, because remember, Cambodians and Vietnamese, and there were Koreans. We have immigrants. They come to America, but they were Christians, especially Koreans. That's a whole nother story. So they come to America, and they want to pass their own heritage onto their children. And so you could drive down streets in Chicago, and in this church you could see Korean American church meets here, whatever day, whatever time. And you look over, Vietnamese Christian church meets here, whatever day, whatever time. Cambodian Christian church meets here. And it was perfectly acceptable because everybody understood that they were going to be speaking their language there. They were going to be eating their food there. They're going to be bringing their kids there so that they could be have their own cultural heritage. They were Americans. They were in America. But we said, oh, that's very nice. We want them to enjoy those things, except not Jews. God said no to that. God said, no, you can't be under the law again. So everybody got to have a cultural expression, but Jewish people in the church. And Jewish people in the church were just supposed to be quiet and become nice Christians. In fact, that was expected. If people, and this is true about any church nowadays, if a person goes into a church and starts saying impertinent things that are against what the church has been doing for the past 30 years, there's two responses. Either people are unhappy or they're laughed at. They laugh at this person. They tolerate them when they're standing there talking to them, and then after they leave, they laugh at them. So I just wanted Messianic Jews to understand this is where it all came from. And because of that, we were all discipled by different kinds of Christians. In other words, it's unpredictable when you came to the Lord, but there was somebody there who helped you on your path, who talked to you, who you admired, who answered questions for you, and otherwise you would have disappeared a long time ago into Christianity. So there was somebody, and since we were all discipled by different people, we don't have any guarantee as to what you were taught about Scripture, what you were taught about Scripture, what they were taught about Scripture. And it doesn't often come up because we're talking about different topics. But there are certain things that have not been thought through by people in the Messianic movement now, and they've passed this along to their children. So I have here 10 of these things that are, yeah, go ahead, did you?
Just a quick postscript. At that time, there were also large numbers of Jewish people who were becoming believers, and not necessarily through the churches. But these particular people who were becoming followers of Yeshua then had to be discipled. And even if they were being discipled by people like us who were Jews who had been in churches, even if they were being discipled by people, like I said, by people who were Jews in churches, those Jews who were in churches were in turn discipled by people who were not Jews. So that's part of the story that Patrice was just mentioning, that in one sense the Messianic Jewish movement came out of evangelical Christianity, because even if the new people were, like I said, led into this movement by Jewish people, those Jewish people were in fact trained by people in the church.
And down through the years, there have been Jewish missionaries from various organizations, and they do not, or at least in the past, I don't know about the 21st century, but definitely in the 20th century, if they had Jewish people coming to know the Lord, they would not send them to a Messianic synagogue. They would send them to a church. And that still occurs, where that problem, once again, it is compounded. And as I said, then the family passes the knowledge along, whether it's correct or incorrect, passes along the knowledge to their kids. So it never really gets dealt with. It never gets brought. Here's what we learned during the 1960s when we were all rabble-rousers and troublemakers and just couldn't let well enough alone and needed to have things our own way. Here's what we learned. I learned in college. Not in one of my classes, by the way. So if you have a problem in your culture that needs a problem that needs to be remedied or righted or dealt with, the way that you do it is, it's hidden. It's underneath here, but you see it. Maybe 3 or 4 other people see it. Here's what you have to do. You have to lift that statement or that idea up to the surface and say what it is, and then everybody has a chance to look at it and say, oh, I didn't even know that was going on. We need to do something about that, because it's only by lifting this thing that's offensive or bad idea or not thought through, only by lifting it up, having people actually look at it, and then deciding, is this something we want to keep, or is this something we want to jettison? And a lot of these attitudes that I'm reading about, I got these off the top of my head. I did not do any prior research. These were just things that, yeah, there's one and there's one. I actually didn't have enough time to write down very many, so this is a selection. And so what I did in the talk was, all right, so I'm talking to these leaders of Messianic congregations. I'm going, listen, we have never had theological examinations of leadership in the union. I'm not saying we should, but perhaps even you, leaders, may have been discipled by somebody And you may sincerely believe some of the statements I'm going to say, but they're not true. Don't you want to hear some of the, you could have fallen into the trap and not even realize that, yeah, that's not so. Because they say a lot of wacky things about Jews in churches. Have you ever noticed that? Yeah, it seems like every time John and I would show up, they would say, and this, I would say back in the 80s and the 90s, we have to be at a church for something. And then somebody would say something, we're just going like this. No, it's not right, no. But, you can't interrupt if you're not in charge.
But that means that this same stuff, these traps that people have fallen into, are there not just in churches, they're in Messianic congregations as well.
Because they've been learned by the very good Jewish disciples of Christians. All right, so here's a few of them. We're not going to take the time to counter every one of them, are we? No.
We could briefly.
Well, I labeled this. Maybe you, talking to the leaders, have fallen into one of these traps. So I've presented them not as anti-Semitism, but these are traps, and they need to be reconsidered by all of us and not just passed along as though they're true. Okay. And as I said, I just worded these the way they came out of my head. Number 1, during the Second Temple period, the vast majority of Jews rejected Jesus. It's not true. I don't know how they responded to each one of them, because by this time I was running late and I was just trying to get in a few. Is this true? Is this statement true? The vast majority of the Jewish people during the Second Temple period rejected Jesus. Untrue. 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 Do we have to go into this?
No. Say one or two things.
Okay. One of the things I do want to say is this. Oh, yeah.
Well, just to put something to your statement, didn't they, when Jesus was walking towards his crucifixion site, it was lined with people, and what kind of people were in Jerusalem during Passover?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Jewish people.
They were Jews, yeah. Not a lot of Romans.
A lot of Jewish people were sad and very upset that he was being led to his death.
Right.
Exactly.
And they're crying as he's being led. Absolutely. I think this kind of idea, which is very, very common, and unfortunately all these movies that people are making, either for Hollywood or to put on TV, this is the impression that they give. The vast majority of the Jewish people at that time rejected him, overtly rejected him. And there's so many ways that you can, so many pieces of evidence that you can give that was not true. The one that John and I love to give, and I gave it to somebody who came up to me afterwards and asked, is when you have the crowd in front of Pilate's, when Pilate is having like the trial, and in these one movie, actually two movies and a TV show, when you see that scene, here's Pilate, and he's talking to Yeshua, and there's the crowds at down here, but they can hear what's going on mainly. How many people are shown to be in the crowd? Well, in Mel Gibson's movie, it's thousands. Thousands of people are in that crowd. Thousands of people. There's another made-for-TV movie of the same time period, but it's a series, and it goes into the book of Acts. Once again, they have to scan. This is how many people there are. They're scanning the camera, showing how many people are saying, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. And when you go to Israel and you're taken to the place that's called Pilate's judgment seat, in other words, the area outside of his palace, very small palace there, it probably owned by the Roman Empire, that whoever was governor at that point would stay there when they came to Jerusalem. They did not live there. Pilate did not live in Jerusalem. He lived in Caesarea. Israel at that time was ruled from the city of Caesarea by the Romans. Romans lived in Caesarea. Pilate would have to come on a special trip down to Jerusalem, which they hated that trip. They didn't want to be there. They wanted to go back to their home in Caesarea. So they're there in Jerusalem. They have to put up with this mob. They thought they were very unruly and very ignorant and very dissatisfying. But they had to keep them quiet. So in his judgment seat, in front of his, let's call it a palace there, was where this took place. And they know right where it is. They know right where his judgment seat was. And they know how big this area is. And it's not a giant empty street or empty market in any way. It's a very small area, probably not as big as your house. And you can't fit more than 75 people in this area. So, those who said crucify him, not thousands, not hundreds, dozens, out of, at least during Passover time, my numbers are a little different from his because I took slightly different courses than he did. But what Dr. Strange always said was Jerusalem had a normal population at that time of about 75,000 people. That was normal. It might have only had 40,000 people, Jerusalem. However, when you had Passover time, it swelled because everybody was going down to visit with their relatives and spend Passover in Jerusalem, and it could have as many as 100,000 people there. Out of those, let's say 75,000 people available in Jerusalem during that day when he was put on trial. How many came and stood and said, crucify him? No more than maybe 50 people. So that's supposed to count for the whole nation rejected him. That's what that is supposed to tell us. It can't possibly tell us that. Then it mentions I don't know which gospel it's in, that some of the people who were there were paid to be there. Also, any Jewish person who intends to celebrate the Passover that evening, are they going to be out at 6 o'clock in the morning, hobnobbing with people in the streets? And no, they're busy. They're busy. They're trying to get the food ready. They're trying to get their house ready. They have to entertain their guests from out of town. They're all relatives. I mean, it is, when you see what has actually been expanded into thousands of people from what the area actually is in real life, that whole idea starts to lose any kind of truthful background. That's what I basically explained to the person who talked about this to me. So no, that would be a trap people fall into, that the whole nation rejected Jesus.
And then because they believe that, then they're judging Jewish people in Judaism, and therefore they begin to develop anti-Jewish or anti-Judaic attitudes. Let me add just 3 things to what Patrice already said, if you're done.
Just in general.
Okay. Number 1, when Yeshua was coming into Jerusalem on what is now called Palm Sunday, again, the crowds were there to greet him. And the crowds that greeted him, by what they said verbally and by their actions, were indicating that they were accepting him as Messiah. Second, Acts chapter 21, James, Yeshua's brother, not Yeshua's cousin. James, Yeshua's cousin, was dead by now. He had been killed. But James, Yeshua's brother, meets Rabbi Paul, Rav Shaul, and says that there are literally tens and tens of thousands of Jews in Jerusalem who are followers of Yeshua, who are also devout Jews. And then we're told by a couple historians, one, a modern-day historian by the name of Samuel Bagatti, that the probability historically is that the first 100,000 followers of Yeshua were all Jews. And then by the person often considered the father of church history, a man by the name of Neander, I think his first name was Augustus, he said that by the end of the first century in Israel alone, there were over 1 million Jewish followers of Yeshua, out of a population estimated at that time period to be around 2.5 million.
For the nation.
For the nation, yeah.
Yeah. In fact, it's this concept that all the Jewish people rejected Jesus that leads to, what's the big word that everybody in the Messianic movement used, like they invented it? The supersessionism. Oh, we can't have supersessionism. Well, what is supersessionism? You can't preach that, even though many churches do it every week, although they wouldn't identify it as this. The idea that the Jewish people had a chance, they blew it, and now the Christians are the people of God. So all the promises that went to the Jewish people, they didn't want them, so now we have them. And lucky us. We're so good. We're so smart. We would never reject Yeshua. How could anybody do that? Well, they deserve anything that happens to them. Which is literally what St. Augustine said 400 years later. Well, you know, those Jewish people, they rejected Yeshua. And so they've been pushed out of the land. It's really we're so sad for them. They've been pushed out, and they're doomed to wander forever. This is what Augustine said about the Jewish people. But that's okay. That's okay. At least they didn't all get killed. And they're there to give Christians an example of what not to do. That's why they're wandering. God left them to wander so they would teach us as Christians that we can't do what the Jewish people did. Do you see how that's backing into anti-Semitism, right? Because we're now the people of God, and they no longer are the people of God. And this is just the first excuse on the way for Christians to say that. Let me give you just another example, because we don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, because as I said, I have 10 of these.
Well, we could spend a couple now and then pick up a few later.
Okay, number 2 is, and I just made this as I was typing it in, the Pharisees hated Jesus and he hated them. And according to many churches, maybe not all churches, but many churches, and we should hate Pharisees too, and Pharisees would hate us if they were around. And what I said to my audience the other day was, I guess that means that we maybe should think twice about putting on the seminar. John and I were going to put on a seminar saying, I'm glad I'm a Pharisee and you should be too. I don't know if people laughed at that. I don't know if they heard. There was a lot of kerfuffling all around. Jesus hated Pharisees and he hated them. But it says so. One of the problems with this particular statement is that when you say this is not true, then they're going to look up every single verse in the Gospels that say, and the Pharisees did this that was wrong, and the Pharisees did that was wrong, and further, and here's another verse where Yeshua hated the Pharisees and they hate him. So I think that would need a really strong scholar or group of scholars to go through and get every statement about Yeshua and the Pharisees, dividing them from the Sadducees. That's a totally different group, just like the Essenes, totally different group, and there's 24 possible divisions of Jewish people during Yeshua's lifetime that were hanging around. So, what would you like to sum up about why this is not true? The Pharisees hated Jesus, and Jesus hated them right back.
Well, I will first of all give you the title of one of the required texts for the Gospels course that I taught last semester. And the title is actually Jesus the Pharisee. It's written by a rabbi whose name is Harvey Falk, F-A-L-K, and he talks about just this. If you look at the teachings of the Pharisees, there are basically two main groups at Yeshua's time: those who are in fact followers of Hillel and those who are followers of Shammai. If you look at the teachings of Hillel, you will find that much of what Yeshua says. Let me put it this way: much of what Yeshua says is replicated in the teachings of Hillel. There are a couple times when he agrees with Shammai, but most of the time it's with Hillel. There was one other thing I was going to say about that. Yeah, I'll get to that in a minute. Then you have Yeshua, so you compare Yeshua's teachings and you find they line up with the Pharisees, certainly from the group related to Hillel. By the way, another rabbi, Rav Shaul, Paul, was taught by one of by a fellow by the name of Gamaliel, who was part of the family or the household of Hillel. So his teachings are very much in line with that. But Yeshua himself said, this is Matthew 23, whatever the Pharisees teach, do it. And he said in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, you need to not only pattern your life after the example of the Pharisees, you need to go even beyond it. Because the Pharisees at that time were considered what we would call the paramount of piety, or paradigms for piety. So that's Yeshua's relationship. And in fact, I have said in classes before, the Pharisees were ultimately the antecedents, the progenitors of what becomes known as classical or rabbinic Judaism. This gets me now to the statement I often mention in class, and that is, you can't find a teaching of Yeshua that you cannot find in rabbinic literature, in the literature of the rabbis or the Pharisees, with the exception of the claims Yeshua made about himself. But what he taught was taught by a good chunk of the Pharisees around him.
Okay, so that's just the beginning of that. Number 3, and this is really commonly believed. If I stood out in front of the Target down the road and asked, okay, leave me, bye-bye. I'm sure he's going to do something important. If I was to stand outside of the Target and interview people as they walked in the door, so a whole different group of everybody who goes through the door of Target on a day, and ask them if this was true, they would say absolutely true. And here's his statement. Religious Jews believe that they can be saved by performing good deeds. That's normally what people in churches are taught about Jewish people. They think they can be saved because they do enough good stuff. Ironically, a whole bunch of people who call themselves Christians think this too. In other words, they call themselves Christians. They haven't been to a church in like 20 years. When they go there, they don't listen. But they also think that when I get up to see St. Peter at the pearly gates, even though, that's just a metaphor for I just died, now what's going to happen to me? So I walk up to Peter at the pearly gates, and he's going to say, why should I let you into heaven? And what I'd say out of 100 people, 85 are going to say, because I did more good stuff than bad stuff. Because I'm basically a good person, and bad people should not be allowed in, but I'm not a bad person. Like Hitler, he shouldn't be allowed in. And name 3 evil people. Those 3 guys, they should not be allowed in. But me, I've always tried to do my best. So I'm asking you, theologians, is that what you expect St. Peter to say to people? When asked the question, why should I let you in here? No, none of that. But it's amazing how many Christians in real life would say it's because I'm a good person and I do more good things than bad. But the original statement was, how are Jewish people presented in many churches? Well, they're presented as people who think they can get into heaven by performing good deeds, or mitzvahs, or mitzvot, as we know that more correctly called. Is that in any sense true? I'm talking about religious Jews, not Jewish people who walk down the street who happen to be born into a Jewish family. I'm talking about religious Jews. They really are working on understanding their faith. They really consider them to be following the Lord God of Israel. They think they can be saved by performing good deeds. Is that true? No. Not for a minute. Not true. Would you say that's... I'm handling this very well as far as being calm. So, what are you going to tell us?
I want to grab our Messianic Siddur, which of course is firmly based on Siddurs and on the prayers of
Religious Jews.
Of Jewish people down through the ages. And here's what we say on Shabbat morning.
Every Shabbat.
Every Shabbat. Okay. Here it goes. With abounding love you have loved us, O Lord our God, and great overflowing tenderness you have shown us. Our Father, our King, for our Father's sake, who followed your guidelines, but who trusted in you, and to whom you did teach the statutes of life, so be gracious to us and teach us. It's built on God's graciousness and compassion. O our Father, merciful Father, always compassion, have mercy on us. Right? Again, God's actions in mercy on the people. And then it says, put it within our hearts to understand, enlighten our eyes in your scripture, unify our hearts to love and to revere your name, that we might never be put to shame. Because we have trusted in your holy, great, and revered name, we shall rejoice and be glad in your saving power. How do people experience God's saving power? Because we have trusted in your holy, great, and revered name, and then therefore shall bring us in peace from the four corners of the earth. In the daily prayers in traditional synagogues around the world, you will pray at least twice a week in the morning prayers, not because of our righteousness or our good deeds, but because of your mercy. Accept us. That is what Judaism teaches and reinforces on a daily and a Shabbat basis, but that isn't necessarily what many Christians and many Messianic Jews feel about religious Jews.
Correct.
Or about Judaism in general.
In general. It's a straw man argument. Does anybody know what a straw man argument is? It's ever so interesting. So a straw man argument is where you define something and you have this very, very good and complete definition of something, and then you tear it down and prove how wrong that person is. So this idea of all Jews believe that good deeds can save you is a straw man or straw person, in that they posit something that is not true, and then they tear that image down and say, they're not correct. Unfortunately, we do this at times in our life. Everybody does it, except it shouldn't be done when you're describing a whole group of people in the United States and you don't really know how they think they're saved. Go ahead.
I think rather than go into the next one, I think we should probably conclude with this and see if there's any further questions.
Or we can do this one. That's fairly short.
Oh, okay.
That one should have gone up.
Okay. There is, I'm trying to remember the author's name. It'll probably, I will probably get to it in the, in this present course, this semester's course on the epistles from a Jewish perspective. And we'll talk about this subject that we've been talking about also a little further, what the Jews believe about relationship with God. We'll do that, I think, in this course as well. But there's a book that was written, I think the title is The 10 Great Freedoms, the Myth of Rabbinic Myth of Rabbinic Legalism. Written by a rabbi. 10 Great Freedoms, the Myth of Rabbinic Legalism. This idea that you can be saved by performing good deeds, as the PowerPoint said, that's the concept of legalism. And as the rabbis have said, rabbis who studied this said, and particularly this particular author puts it into the title of the book, it's a myth, the myth of rabbinic legalism.
As I said, it's if you were to walk down the street or stand at the door of Target and you ask the Jewish people who walk through the door of Target and you ask them as a group, 21st century Americans, and around here there's not going to be a large percentage of religiously educated Jews. There may be some, but the majority of the Jewish people you would talk to would have this concept. I'm a good person. I don't do bad things as much as I do good things. I've really been trying my whole life, and therefore God will let me into heaven. That's true about any American because they're not educated. Those of us who are more theologically astute will do a better job to St. Peter about why God should let us into heaven.
She said any American, not any American Jew. Many, if not most, American Christians will say, who think of themselves as Christians, will say the same thing.
Same thing. It's, when you think about it, it's somewhat discouraging, really. And also, I do want to say this. Many believers, if they go to church regularly, not all believers do, and if they, have been listening and paying attention and they've been there for, let's say, 10 years, 20 years, they've picked up things. Usually they rely more. There are believers who are sitting in churches and every day they read the scriptures. And then there's way more believers in churches who let the people up front tell them what the scriptures say, and they go, that's interesting, and then they go on to live their life and forget about what they heard at church, except for, that seems right, I'm going to go on. But how many of us really open the scriptures and look at them and try to understand them and ask questions about them for ourselves? Percentage is so small. And even though everybody would do that, they read the scriptures for themselves and they'd be studying and they'd be learning new things. If that's all you're talking to, there's the whole big bad world out there, and they're not. But some people limit the people in their sphere to believers only, and not just any believers, but people who love Jesus. And that's fine, except then you lose the ability to talk about people out there in the grocery store and people over there in Macy's and people there in Disney World. And that's a whole different group of people at Target. It's a whole different group of people. And if you are confined and only speaking to other believers during your day, that's going to make you a little wacky. That's a theological term that I'm using. A little wacky. Remember, people may have good hearts. They may intend to be doing the best they can. Let's just take it for granted they do think that they are doing really a lot of good work, and they do believe that they're making right choices. We all fail, but in general, they're doing good deeds definitely outweigh bad deeds. Good deeds heavy, bad deeds light. And it's those kinds of evaluations that we have to run away from. That we need to always, when asking how we're doing, we need to always go to Scripture and check it out and see how we're doing. Is that a pep talk?
That's a pep talk.
It's a pep talk.
All right, and we should conclude on that pep talk because I'm looking at that.
Oh.
Any questions on what we've just covered? We did genealogies and now we did this. So any questions on this stuff? All right.
They're either asleep or we've totally convinced them.
So then we may share some of the rest of what comprised Patrice's talk in future sessions.
I didn't get to a couple of the really good ones.
Yeah.
And by good ones, I mean really, really bad ones. That many, many people say that is not totally untrue, wrong. Don't you wish you could, when you hear stuff like that, you could say, that's totally not true. It's wrong. And then, you have an opportunity to say something. But, yeah, that only happens, I think, when I'm falling asleep. And I'm thinking, well, what if I could say, what would I say to that person? Oh, okay. And that puts me right to sleep.
I can't figure out how to raise my hand, but good evening.
Hi.
Shabbat Tov.
Hi,
Miss
Virginia.
you all very much. What I'm dealing with here, and I run into some of these things, and in fact, this morning I was telling my driver just about the very first one that you brought up, and defending Yeshua and relationship, and that, where'd it go? I took notes. My notes
dear.
are a mile long. But the very first one you talked about that that the Pharisees hated the Jews, and it was the Jews that persecuted him, and I explained that whole situation, and she'll go back and read the Bible and verify it. But what I'm dealing with here more is people who just beg God all the time to correct the suffering that they have going on in their lives, and the heavy prayer, just standing over and praying over, and the one that my oldest son's getting into is demons, cast out demons. And I'm like, oh brother, here we go. How do I get through this? And sometimes you just sit back and let it be, and find the opportunities when you can to encourage the behaviors that are more scripturally oriented. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, and that area you just mentioned is a whole different area than what we've been talking about. It would need its own session.
Oh, yeah, about 3 sessions.
Yeah.
But Virginia, as a parent of adult children, it's been my experience that if it's your son, for instance, you may be different. God may bless you in many, many ways that we don't even know about. But if your son is going to learn true things, he's probably not going to get most of them from you. He's probably going to have to get most of them from other people that he respects. I'm not saying that our children don't appreciate what they've learned from us, but when it comes to specific things that they get wrapped up in, the parents correcting them usually does not work. It usually has to come from somebody else. And so I'd be praying that other people come into your son's life that he does listen to and he does look up to. Of course, he looks up to you in a certain way, but then again,
yeah, he came.
Yeah.
He came to me to get, how to say, not blessing, but Mom, this is what I'm thinking of doing. Please give me your opinion. Mm-hmm. So I tried to keep it short and sweet because he is a male and he is going through, oh God, they're going through a divorce in Texas,
No.
so
that's
pray
too
for
bad.
them.
That's too bad.
Yeah, and he feels it's demon oriented, and and he's got a group around him that they pray away the demons, and he understands walking with the Lord is important, and that's how you live. So I think he more or less came to me, and I tried to keep it as short and sweet, and to say getting involved in casting demons requires X, Y, and Z. Are you really there yet?
Interesting. Good for you.
And speaking of prayer,
Yeah.
we should conclude.
Right, but
Thank you.
Barbara has
Love
her
you
hand
guys.
up. We love you too, and we'll pray for your son.
Yeah, Barbara, you just saw your hand.
Yeah, two things. One, please continue this discussion because even not in a leadership role, but having not able to be in a Messianic congregation anymore, I run into this all the time. And I'm getting called Jewish Barbara now, which is a good thing because I defend the Gospels according to their Jewish perspective. But yeah, the one that drives me the most crazy is, well, I just don't understand why the Jews didn't accept Jesus. Like,
He's so
okay,
nice. Why wouldn't
you got
anybody
it? You got an
accept him?
hour or so. But the main thing that and I told Dr. John Thursday, I love when he talks about covenant, because if you have half a brain, you have to realize that supersessionism is a bad deal. Because if God can break his promise because these people complained because they were thirsty,
Yes.
I mean, what's he going to do with me? You know, I'm complaining when the air condition goes out. You know,
Absolutely. Yes, and that's what
this is all a bad deal all the way around.
this is why the book of Hosea is so important, because what is it that we learn from Hosea? He could have divorced his wife. He had every right to divorce his wife, and God says, "Don't," and so he doesn't. And who is correct? The person who divorces his wife in that scenario, or Hosea? I have to go with Hosea. And Hosea is never going to give up. He's never going to give up on his wife. You can call
And
him.
that is such good news. It's the foundation of all the good news.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree. And if people would like to, these really are some of the important things that Messianic Judaism has to offer the rest of believers to straighten out the misunderstandings and the ignorance. They're just every week more ignorance gets spread, especially in mega churches. You know, these churches that they have 2,000 people there, and then they send the TV out to more thousands of people. It should be our job as Messianic Jews to begin the discussion and go, let's go through this, shall we? Let's really look at it rather than assuming. Because, and as I saw in one of my books I was reading this week, assume makes an ass out of you and me. And I've known that for a long time, but it was in this book, and I'm going, I bet she wrote that in that book because many people don't know it. So I'm going to start saying that. When you assume, you make an ass out of you and me.
And if you haven't figured out what she just said,
Write it down.
write it down.
And then look at
it'll make sense. And speaking of writing down, Barbara, feel free to remind us of this for our next stump by shooting us an email.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I will too. I also wanted to share with you when I did the birth of Jesus at the barnyard at work. I got to be called Softa of Bethlehem. So I was like the grandmother of Bethlehem, carrying around water and chips and snacks and hand warmers and body warmers and Kleenex for all the enactors. It was really a lot of fun. And I was also free to tell them about the Hebrew word softa and Bethlehem and what it means. And people came back and asked, and I gave away 2 of our those little pamphlets that Matthew made that have the QR codes in them.
Oh,
And
seminary.
I'm hoping that they will
Sign up for
contact
courses,
you
yeah.
all for either these sessions or school.
Cool.
I had a lot of, I focused on the Jewishness of Jesus when I spoke to them.
Cool. And thank you much for passing
Thanks.
around
That's great.
the
I need
PR
more.
literature.
I'll be sending you my address.
Well, do know that it's been redone, so if you may
it-
want to hang on to at least one copy so you've got access to it. But
Does it have a QR
no, it
code?
no longer has the QR code.
Well, just, no, not all of them, but we
None.
could put one. Here's the website.
Oh, yeah. Well, the website is listed, but not as a QR code.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
it looks way cool if you have a QR code. We go to the Florida Orchestra concerts, and you can't get a paper program anymore. You have to get
No.
the QR card, and you read it on
Right.
your phone.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yep. All right.
Okay.
I'll send you an envelope.
great.
All right.
All right.
Closing prayer.
Oh, of course. Avinu Malchenu, our Father and our King, we thank you and praise you that you have brought us this far, that we keep, Lord, by your will, we keep moving forward. Father, help us to continually look to you, to look to your word, and help us to continue to reach out to other people. We pray that we would see your footsteps in front of us, that we would have a feel for the path that we're on, and that, Father, you would keep us encouraged along the way. Be with our families and friends as we're on our path. We thank you for all you do for us every day. B'Shem Yeshua, Meshachenu, in the name of Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen.
Amen. And thank you all for joining us, both those of you who are here, those of you who are on the monitors. Oh, not just both. And thirdly, those who will join us later. And we'll see